Okay, two top stories. Where is Raila? And number two, a comparison of our democracy in line of Africa and other Western organizations. I'm your host Ugola, and this is the Civic Lens. So let's start with the first bit. Where is Raila Odinga? Up to the time we're doing this podcast, nobody clearly knows the whereabouts of the right former Prime Minister Raila Odinga. And in X, people are even discussing him posthumously, which is actually a very sad thing. From his secretariat, they are giving us a clear indication through the press conference they made that he's well and is in a routine trip. But certain voices from his ODM party are asking Kenyans to pray for him for reasons that we do not know. So let's go back a little bit. Sometimes back around a month and a half ago, Orengo played the same stunt. And for Orengo, you could understand that the Siaya people felt the wrath of his disappearance because he's elected to represent them. But Orengo's issue could have been so recent, and we'll come back to it. Let's go back to 1976. In 1976, there was a group of members of parliament affiliated to the Mount Kenya region that took a motion to parliament to discuss who would replace Kenyatta if Kenyatta died. Now, this motion did not see the light of the day because it was discussing the exit of a president who was still alive and kicking. And so later on, 2 years later, Kenyatta died. Yeah, he did. So let's come back to the Orengo thing. You see, Raila is neither Orengo nor Kenyatta. He's not a governor elected to represent an interest of a county. Neither is he a president whose exit or replacement could be discussed through a motion in parliament. Yet, as Raila exists himself, he is an individual who is a powerhouse with support cutting across major of these counties in Kenya right now, and support going so high that the president needs him by his side, as you have seen the president going with him everywhere, including the Chan competitions previously before his disappearance. So he sits at this middle position where he is needed by his supporters, but is not representing any constituent. Neither is he a symbol of national unity to the level of a president. So people are asking, where is Raila Odinga? Now, it's very important that I make this clear that up to the time we are discussing this podcast here today, we do not know where Raila is. Certain information might come during the editing period before it's uploaded, but by the time we are doing this pod, Raila's location or wherever Raila is not known to the public domain. So it's a discussion that I do not want to go in depth, because if Raila comes back, of course, the way we did with Orengo, we will discuss where he was. And if he fails to come back, then we'll have better things to discuss on his absence. However, at this point, we are just obeying the request that has been made by certain ODM officials that wherever he is, let's pray for Baba to come back healthy and strong. Now, for Orengo's case, Orengo came back healthy and strong and is still alive, serving the people of Siaya. That's good for him. But for Kenyatta, the posthumous discussions that existed previous to his death perhaps contributed to his death 2 years later. That is not the fate we wish for Raila Odinga, and we pray for him that when he comes back, he will give an explanation on where he was. Now, that aside, let's go to our main story. In the wake of Reject Finance Bill, that's early 2024, we saw an introduction of new involvement in governance and issues leadership that did not exist before. And this was the introduction into governance and leadership by the young people calling themselves the Gen Zs. Now, it is notable that whatever was witnessed in Kenya in 2024 June and 2025 June and the time existing in between is not an isolation issue, and it's something that is being experienced across board, both in Africa and beyond. And that will be the basis of our lenses today here at the Civic Lens, and I'm your host Ugola. We want to take a look at three things, that is the Gen Z revolt, the one-term president, and the military coup in line of Kenya, in line of Africa, and in line of the Western world. So let's start with the Gen Z revolt. If you read a book by Cal Newport called Digital Minimalism, then you will understand this particular group of population that is young deeply. This is what Cal Newport talks about, the I generation, the generation that he calls the I generation, but it's publicly and across border known as the Gen Zs. This is the first generation that has grown with the technology in their hands. From the time they were born, from the schools that they have gone to, until now that they're actual citizens that can make an input on the voter mass of the nation, they have had the gadget by themselves. Now, this population is growing amidst a population that has seen life before technology and is now seeing life with technology. But the Generation Z do not have an experience of life before technology. As a result of this, their attention span has gone down and their mental health issues has gone up, because then they are cut from the societal fabrics of developing the mind because of their gadgets. But on the positive rise, our generation, the Gen Z, is the generation that has shown that governance and leadership can be looked beyond the acts of parliament that are stored away that people cannot access, or the bills of the parliament that are often stored away that people can hardly access, and can be reduced to X, to TikTok, to Instagram, to hashtags and memes, so that every other person can take part in governance. Now, this brilliant move has not been a Kenyan isolation issue per se. If you remember, in 2020, there was a revolt in Nigeria, and this was a very special revolt in Nigeria that was witnessed in 2020. It was called the NSARS, or rather has been popularly known as NSARS. Now, this particular movement that was pioneered by the youth to end the involvement of the SARs in Nigeria was purely pioneered and ran by the youth. But 2020 might have run your memory because of COVID and everything that was happening during that time. People put their focus in COVID rather than in revolutions across the continent. Then you might remember 2019 when the youth rallied on the streets to ensure that Omar al-Bashir of Sudan was going home, and it did happen that Omar al-Bashir went home as a result of the youthful population of Sudan that went on the streets to oust him. Sudan aside, Senegal has witnessed these particular issues twice, just like Kenya, as we witnessed it in 2024 and 2025, calling for reforms through the youth. In Senegal, both in 2021 and 2024, there was a call by the youth to see reforms. Now, from the aspect of Gen Zs themselves and the Gen Z demonstrations in Kenya, witnessed in 2024 and 2025, you could see a broader sense than in Africa, in Nigeria, in Senegal, which is in the west, in Sudan, which are just our neighbors. This has been a consistent move across border. And later on, when we're finishing this part, maybe we will discuss the effect of this and the projection of this come the next 5 or 10 years on the democracies of countries like Uganda, democracies of countries like Congo, where the aspect of democracy is yet to actually pick up. So it's commendable that the Gen Z revolt is not something that Kenyan population is to be celebrated for in isolation, but it's something that now calls upon the region entirely in Africa to take a look at this young population that grew with the phones in their hands, with the tablets in their hands, and is now shifting governance from private confidential government documents to open and verifiable public documents that everyone can actually take a look at. It's really commendable for the Gen Zs in Nigeria, Gen Zs in Kenya, Sudan, and Senegal for actually being pioneers in this area locally. But let's take a look of Gen Zs beyond our confines or our borders to the international space. You see, in the international space, this is the difference. Locally in Kenya and in Africa, Gen Zs are taking it to the streets to actually have reforms on the political institutions that we feel are not inclusive of this young population. But ukiangalia now the Western world, Gen Zs are going to these international spaces or these governance spaces internationally, not for politics. You can remember the lady called Greta who started the climate change movement abroad, a change that has actually has a lot of people rallying behind it. Sometimes back there was a gentleman that was killed and the entire United States of America went into Black Lives Matter, and after the overturning of Roe v. Wade, you've seen demonstrations in the United States of America being agitated towards acknowledgement of reproductive health rights. So it shows that for us, a weak democracy in Africa, our focus is still now to make sure that our political institutions are right to include us so that our policies can exist as young people. But for these developed nations like United States of America, these platforms have developed their political institutions so strongly that the revolt that we are seeing with their new Gen Zs that have grown with the same fonts, just like Sudan, Nigeria, Senegal, and Kenya, is not to have political equity anymore, but to introduce even more key certain things to the life of Gen Zs beyond politics. Things like reproductive health, things like climate change, and when racial segregation and racial discrimination is witnessed, we have had movements like Black Lives Matter to restore racial equity. So it's very commendable that this young population right now locally has woken up to have these particular institutions recognize them. And we hope in the next 10, 20, 30 to 50 years, when now more younger people, when this population will be old, when more younger people will be walking into these places or into these spaces to advocate for reform, the reforms will not be political or governance or leadership. That one, the current Gen Z will have taken care of. But the reforms will now be on issues reproductive health, global climate change, and racial segregation, the way we are borrowing from the Western world. So yeah, it's in comparison and in conclusion of just that aspect, it's clearly important to say that the world is seeing a revolt of new leadership in political spectrums, but even in institutions or in countries where leadership is strongly codified, the world is seeing reforms of the young people in certain key aspects of their lives which had not been witnessed pre the gadget generation. Now, that is just one spectrum. Let's look at the spectrum of one-term president. Now, that's a major story here in Kenya right now. One term is a slogan that is being chanted everywhere. You go to a public setup and you feel bored, the next thing you want to chant is one term. You first look around if there are officers of the DCI or such like people who can capture you, and in absence of any of them, you shout at the top of your lungs, one term. So let's look at one term in line of African countries that have actually enjoyed a president conceding defeat and transisting power to another president without weakening the institution or without causing an unrest within that country. In 2015, Jonathan Goodluck of Nigeria was actually the first man to witness the change within the continent of an incumbent African president going home after serving for just one term. Prior to Jonathan Goodluck of Nigeria in 2015, we had not seen a president sitting within a democratic setup in Africa who served for one term and went home. Most of them would serve for 2 terms, 3, 4 terms. Others would serve for lifetime terms, like our neighbors who are actually yet to have an election, and we almost know how the election is going to turn out. So in 2015 is when we witnessed Jonathan Goodluck going home after one term, and perhaps it sparked the one-term spirit across the African border, because the neighbors of Nigeria a year later, that's Ghana, in 2016, also took their John Mahama home for, just after serving one term. So the gentleman Jonathan Goodluck finished his term in 2015. Nigeria did that. Then Ghana witnessed it, and when Ghana went to elections in 2016, they did the same with their John Mahama. And so Ghana, being the first African country to actually receive independence, became the second African country to take a president home based on one term. Beautiful. Then Liberia did the same with George Weah in 2023, and George Weah actually accepted his defeat, without causing unrest or weakening the institutions that exist within Liberia. So within this Western spectrum, because these countries are actually very close to each other in the western part of Africa, we have seen the one-term thing becoming a normal spectrum for them. Nigeria 2015, Ghana 2016, 2023, Liberia did it. And so Malawi, next to us, also did the same thing in 2020. We saw Peter Mutharika in 2020 actually serving for his one term, going home, and only coming back to make a comeback in 2025. Something that had not been witnessed in Africa, had only been witnessed in US when Trump actually received his defeat and took a year, an election period or an election year gap away, and then came back for another election period and won. So the same US system is what we witnessed with Malawi, with the one-term presidency of Peter Mutharika to 2020, accepting defeat, coming back in the scene in 2025 2025 and winning. So it's commendable that as democracy and human rights issue get a hold in the African space, we can have examples of African countries that have shown that you don't have to destroy the entire system when you're living. You don't have to cause unrest when you're being hosted. You can actually be a gentleman and accept defeat and do one term and go home. And so as we look towards our election of 2027, where a lot of excitements are in there, these four examples from the African spectrum gives us confidence that it can be done the African way. If we wanted our good President William Ruto to go home like most of us want that in 2027, it can be done, it will be done. So that is with a comparison of one term locally. Now let's look with the Western nations. You see, with the Western nations, I'll just give two spectrums. United States of America, which is a very interesting country, being the super veto in the entire world. So most comparisons being done against United States of America make sense. In 1980, James Carter actually served his one term and finished without breaking down the institutions or causing unrest for the United States of America. In 1992, the same fate would befall George Bush, who also served for his one term and went home without doing any harm to the country. Now, Donald Trump comes third in this list as a president of the United States of America, who went one term, came back and went another one term after a 4-year period, because they do their elections out every 4 years, after a 4-year period of another president serving. And during this 4-year period gap, there was Biden in that seat. And when now Trump came back for his second term, he floored every other candidates that existed there. So you see the Trump behavior compared to now George Bush and also compared to James Carter before him can only be compared to Peter Mutharika's scene in Malawi. So it shows that in terms of having our president serve for one term, we are actually ahead of most of these Western countries that give 2 terms or more terms to their democratically elected people. And we are setting a precedent that as Africa, we might actually in the next 2 or 3 elections be the continent that ensures that president serves for one term and leaves room for other presidents to serve. I've forgotten France, actually, where Nicolas Sarkozy in 2012 also served this one term. So this is just a message I'm putting out there here from the civic lens, that we are experiencing a development in our democracy that is hugely commendable. And if we keep experiencing this as an Africa as a whole, then even Kenya as a country, we could have a system of now reducing our presidents from 2 terms, as they've historically served before, to actually serving for one term and looking for another president who wants to serve for another one term. And this perhaps plays in favor of Honorable Martha Karua, whose entire manifesto is based on the fact that if you elect her, she will go for one term. So we perhaps could consider that once we make our house clean in 2027, then we can elect a president whose major manifesto is to go for one term. I'm not campaigning for Martha Karua, neither am I campaigning for ousting of President Ruto. I am just out there putting facts as they are, impartial as they are, for your own analysis and digest. Now, the last thing is this issue of Osotsi, the likes that threatened President Ruto that if things are not well done, then they are going to take power and hand it over to the military. These threats are coming shortly after 1982. We actually witnessed as a nation a threat that was actualized. Honorable Ezekiah Ochuka, and in one of the episodes we did here, the Civic Lens, detailing that occurrence of 1982, took power from President Moi and served for 6 hours before now power was taken back to President Moi, and the good gentleman later hanged. Now, this whole aspect of military coup within the Kenyan space has to be quietened, because treason is a very key thing. It's actually one of the capital offenses in Kenya, whose punishment is death penalty. But if you see how the coups have developed within the Western region that has also given a spectrum with one term, you'd say that Mali, Gabon, Niger, Burkina Faso, Chad, and Sudan have had stable governments come into power as a result of military coups. And so this aspect of military coups is an African thing that is taking part on the Northern Delta very seriously. And if threats like that are being made locally by Osotsi, then perhaps they are withdrawing, or rather, pardon me, they are drawing conclusions from these Western countries that have done it before. So coups is not something that has been witnessed in the Western region that we are comparing this analysis to. We have not witnessed any active coup in the United States of America, and the reason is these institutions are so strong that an exit of a president cannot actually shake the institutions or cause an unrest. But for us African countries, our institutions are so weak that when a member of parliament, or rather a president, is being ousted, he ensures that he weakens the system or causes unrest as leaves. We hope and we educate here at the Civic Lands that as our democracy shapes and as our eyes gets clear to see democratic principles very clearly, then we can develop to a nation that can actually transit from one power dynamic to another power dynamic, first in one term, and two, from one power dynamic to another power dynamic without causing unrest or without affecting the institutions that has taken us years to build and to create. This is the Civic Lens.